Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Do's and Don'ts of Communicating with Your Community During COVID-19. For those of you who are returning Candid webinar participants, a warm welcome back. And for those of you here for the first time, I'm so glad you're joining us today. My name is Catalina Espinel, Program Manager for Candid based in New York. I will be supporting today's webinar by managing polls as well as collecting questions you ask along the way. My colleagues, Dorothy Ho and Kristen Kenner, will also be supporting behind the scenes, making sure we're able to answer all of your questions. I would now like to introduce Eva Nico, Senior Director of Programs at Candid. She would be leading today's conversation. Eva, welcome.
Thank you very much, Catalina, and hello, everyone. I am so happy that you have joined us today for what's a really interesting and exciting program where we'll be talking a bit about communication and talking about it in two ways. Really communicating with the people and the communities that you serve, especially at this extraordinary time, and then also communicating your work with your donors, supporters, and stakeholders. As we're all feeling the distance, we're using technology and other means in order to stay in touch with all of the stakeholders that are important in our work. Before we delve in, I want to welcome to the webinar two fabulous co-presenters with me, Meg VanDeusen from Feedback Labs. And Meg, where are you joining us from today?
Hi, I'm joining us from Washington, D.C., where Feedback Labs is based. We are a nonprofit working to make feedback and listening the norm across aid, philanthropy, nonprofits, and government.
And we're also welcoming to the webinar Yessica Cancel from the PACE Center for Girls. Yessica, welcome, and tell us where you're joining us from.
Good afternoon. I am joining from Jacksonville, Florida. So we are in the northern part of Florida.
Fabulous. Well, it's going to be a great conversation, but before we delve in, let me say a little bit about Candid and who we are. So Candid was formed about a year ago, and when GuideStar and Foundation Center joined forces, really bringing together over 88 years of expertise and millions of data points to bear on people who are trying to do good in the world. We see that millions of organizations spend their resources, their time, their passion trying to affect change in the world. We try to provide support in that by looking for information on who's getting funding, who's not getting funding, where does it go, and why does it matter? We do this through research, collaboration, and training, trying to connect people who are trying to change the world with the resources to do it. You can find out more about us at candid.org. We also recognize that this is an extraordinary time that we're living in for a number of reasons, and we have mobilized many of Candid's resources, our information about funding, our research reports, our trainings, in order to respond to what's happening in the world today. Some of that really concerns the current COVID-19 pandemic, and you can find a link to those resources in this slide. And I will say, for those of you for whom this information may be flashing by very quickly, please know that this is a PDF handout that you already have access to, and there will also be a recording of this webinar shared after we're done. So no need to scramble to take notes at the moment, but know that these links to resources are going to be available to you during and after this webinar. We are encouraging folks to go and check out what are some of the latest funds that are getting established to respond to the pandemic. And there is also news there about what's happening specifically in the social sector and the response. So without further ado, let's talk a little bit about how we're going to spend our time together today. we wanted to make sure that we talked about listening to community, both in terms of principles and practice. And so we're going to learn a bit more about the work that the PACE Center for Girls is doing and how they're applying some of the principles of listening and gathering feedback from the people we serve in their work. We will talk about the do's and don'ts, and Meg and Yessica will lead us through that. And then I will also lead us through how some of this information about your feedback practices, as well as other aspects of your organization's work, are really important to share on your nonprofit profile on GuideStar, because this is where many potential donors, supporters are turning to for information about what's happening with your organization. And then finally, we will point you to some resources and also make sure that we talk about some of your questions. Before we keep talking at you, we'd love to hear from you. So we are going to ask 2 questions before we delve into the content. The first one, and my colleague Catalina, I think, will launch the poll in a moment, is asking, at this time particularly, how much are you listening to the people that you serve? More than usual, less than usual, or about the same? And I'll give us all just a moment or 2 to share and participate in the poll.
Thank you, everyone that's participating on the poll. We see the responses coming in rapidly. We do encourage to participate. This is very helpful information for us.
Absolutely.
I see that
Absolutely,
almost.
Catalina. I see lots of folks hopping in, which is wonderful. Where I think we're about 60–70% of responses.
Probably let's give it 1 minute and then we'll close the poll. Thank you, everyone, for participating.
This is fantastic, Catalina. I think we can close the poll now. I see in my interface that it looks like almost 80% of you participated, so thank you. And that we see that around 52% you're listening even more than usual, even more attentively than usual during this time. 9%, and thank you for your honesty, right, are feeling maybe more isolated from the communities that they serve. And that could be for lots of different reasons, including what we're all dealing with and handling the current circumstances. And then about 40% of you are saying it's staying about the same. You're able to maintain your usual level of contact. So that's really extraordinary given what we're dealing with. And then I will ask us to keep flexing our participation muscle and just say a little bit more about how it is that we are participating. So Catalina, would you mind if we started to launch that poll? So we're asking, how are you listening, right? And you can click, I believe, any of these options or multiple options. Is it via a survey? Is it through virtual calls or video conference, monitoring social media or news, or is still in person that you're able to be in touch, or something else? So I'm curious to have folks hop in there with the how, and we'll give you all a minute to do that. I see lots of folks jumping in. I think we have over 50% of the folks participating, which is wonderful. This is a little bit more of a complicated question with multiple choices, but I am very curious to see really how it is that we're able to leverage technology, especially these days, to stay in touch. I find myself so much more reliant on it than ever before. So it is an unusual time, and it's making us perhaps shift how it is that we're staying in touch with folks.
Yeah, and I would encourage everyone that has voted other, if you would like to share on our chat, that's also appreciated if you want to share what that other option that you're using.
Fantastic. Well, I see that we're almost at 80% of responses again. So Catalina, let's see the results.
There you go.
Fantastic. So over half of us are monitoring on social media and news. So stay kind of trying to understand what's happening in our communities that way. Another very large percentage, 61%, are taking advantage of virtual means to stay in touch, calls, video conference. And then it sounds like about a third of folks, almost a third, are also using other means. So surveying, getting to kind of specific questions, continuing to meet in person, and then that other means, which thanks Catalina for encouraging folks to maybe share what other means for them in terms of how they're staying in touch. It's wonderful. So let's hop to the discussion, and thank you all for participating. Let me actually open up the opportunity for Yessica to come on screen and to tell us a little bit about the work of the PACE Center for Girls.
Sure. Thank you, Ava. And if you want to just go ahead and jump into the next slide, just it gives some high-level information about PACE. But PACE has been around since 1985. We have 21 locations throughout Florida. So we are in every large county in Florida and in many of our smaller counties as well. We serve middle school and high school age girls who are considered at risk. And many times I get the question, at risk of what? At the end of the day, they're at risk of not leading fulfilling lives. And so to some, that means they're at risk of entering the juvenile justice system. Many are at risk of failure in school. And we know through research that having your high school diploma, it has direct correlation to your ability to be self-sufficient and stay out of systems as an adult. And so PACE focuses in providing our services through a gender responsive, trauma-informed, and strength-based lens. And so if you could go to the next slide, wanting to talk a little bit about, so how do we implement that through that lens of listening? And so you'll see our mission there, and at the bottom, it's our philosophy. Within our philosophy statement that was written several decades ago, we talk about really believing that every girl deserves an opportunity to find her voice. So finding that voice from our girls, helping them find that voice has been critical way before feedback was a thing that people were intentionally focusing on. So this has been very natural to PACE. It's part of who we are, and it's part of being a gender responsive program, which means we understand that the life experience of a girl is different than the life experience of a boy, and we create our program around what those needs are. And with girls, we like to behaviorally interact very differently. And so we've been engaged in listening work for many years and have intentionally for the past 5 to 7 years intentionally made it part of our culture. And so what that means is both with our girls, how we interact with each other as team members, and how we engage our communities, all take into account the importance and the value of listening. To us, yes, our clients are our girls, but we really look at our roles and being able to listen is as part of a community, as part of society. And that means we have to listen to all stakeholders. So that is the girls, that's our staff, that's our donors, our volunteers, our political partners in each location where we're at. So listening isn't just a project that we do, it isn't just a survey that we do, but rather it's part of our culture. And it really did start with our philosophy decades ago.
That's wonderful, Yessica. Well, let's talk a little bit about how that's playing out, particularly in today's very odd circumstances. And we're going to talk about it with a little bit of a lens of, the do's and don'ts, given the circumstances that we're in. And I will actually welcome Meg now to the conversation as well. I'm hoping you can go on camera, and then and I'm hoping that really Meg will lead us through some of the principles of feedback. given that Feedback Labs is at the heart of a lot of the practice and the conversations of what's happening with listening these days. And then she and Yessica will kind of talk to us a little bit about how those principles are applied.
Great. Thank you, Eva and Yessica. As Eva said, Feedback Labs really was founded on the idea that communities should be heard, and that too often there are voices that are disenfranchised, and they're the ones that we should be listening to. Listening to our constituents and acting on their feedback is so critical, and especially in a time of crisis like COVID-19, to ensuring that our actions are effective and equitable. The COVID-19 pandemic has challenged systems in ways that many of us have never seen before in our lifetimes, and we really believe that feedback has the power to create the systemic change. And we've been seeing that happen in organizations like PACE Center for Girls, which has inspired us in the ways that they really have been rapidly using feedback to respond to this crisis. So the first principle that I want to highlight today is don't stop listening. I know it can be really tough right now, but the key principle to keep in mind today is that listening to affected communities really is a humanitarian best practice, especially in crisis. One of the key recommendations of the core humanitarian standard is that response should be based on communication, participation, and feedback. And by really focusing on the least heard and the least served, listening can help us identify whose needs aren't being met, and then emphasize diversity, equity, and inclusion in our responses. If you're already working in communities where you've established relationships and you have trust there, start by building on that. If you need to be building trust, make sure to plan for how to do that from the beginning. Even from a distance, we saw in your responses, there are ways that you are engaging in those two-way conversations and building that trust more than simply extracting. But I know that this can be easier said than done. So Yessica, I'd love to hear how PACE has been able to adapt so early and so quickly to ensure that listening could remain a priority even in these challenging circumstances.
Sure, thank you, Meg. Like you mentioned, it's about not stopping, right? We may have one initial question, but once we get that response, it's almost that spiral, not just a loop, but it keeps going, it keeps going. So throughout this whole pandemic, it initially started with listening to our environment. So it was, right, because the pandemic wasn't in the US yet, it wasn't in Florida, it wasn't impacting, but really paying attention to the overall environment, what was happening in different places around the world, that led us to say, what if we ended up having to go virtual? And in our program, our girls come to our centers. It's not residential, they come, it's considered a day program, but we're their school also. So we have teachers, and then we have wraparound services, counselors, therapists, case managers. And we thought, what if we had to go virtual? What would that look like? Would we have to shut down and not provide services? That wasn't ever an option for us. But as we thought about it, we immediately said, well, we need to ask our caregivers and our girls, do they have the tools that would be needed to have a virtual environment in life? And so that meant, do you have access to a laptop or a computer? Do you have internet? Do you have a smartphone? And so we literally almost overnight created a quick survey and sent it out via multiple platforms. We did email, we did via social media, and then in some cases with the girls and or their caregiver, their families, when they were picking up the girls or dropping them off, and asked, share all that information with us. And so we immediately got that response back and recognized that about 40% of our girls didn't have access to reliable technology to be able to continue their education as well as all their support services if we had to go into a remote environment. So then the next step with that was, so what do we do? Right? So we felt we were about 2 weeks ahead of the game. That gave us enough time to jump on board and see what resources we had internally, and those gaps that we had, how could we reach out to our partners in the communities to be able to close those gaps so that Didn't know that 2 weeks later, but we were going to have to go fully virtual to ensure that all of the girls that we served did have access to reliable technology.
That's amazing that you were able to have that foresight and really be able to prepare. And you queued up my next tip perfectly, which is that we do want to be giving people the time, space, and multiple options, as you said, about ways to answer in the way that's going to make the most sense to them. I think, Yessica, you've already outlined perfectly what some of those challenges are when you're trying to access constituents from a wide variety of areas and abilities and access points. But we know that incorporating feedback can help us identify the most effective solutions to be addressing the needs of those that we serve. And so creating these multiple spaces, multiple times, multiple ways that that feedback can be given will really help, especially in this time when we know there are competing priorities. We know that our constituents are stressed and busy and have other high priorities in responding to COVID-19. And so we want to make sure, as we think about the principle of giving this time and space, to also do it in a way that is going to decrease as much as possible the burden that an ask could bring. So we want to keep it short. We want to use the technologies that people are already using, and we want to be asking in places where they already are. So I love the example that you gave us in the pickup lines before we had to go remote, being able to ask those there, not ask people to go out of their way. And by letting the people that we are engaging with who are receiving our services or products know upfront why we're collecting that feedback, how they can continue to communicate us, and what they can expect as a response and a follow-up will help bring down that temperature a little bit in these times of crisis. So I'd love to hear if there's anything else about the ways that you found were best possible to reach the girls and the caregivers and the families on your team.
Sure. And so it's interesting because going back to that continuous feedback, as we were gathering this information, what we didn't ask was how many people had to share. So the answer was yes, there is a laptop or a computer at home, but there's 5 people that have to share that one item. And it was through always having an open-ended space for what else have we not asked, that, you know, several girls and caregivers shared, we have one, but how are we going to be able to, you know, share it with 5 other people in the household? And so it's not stopping at that initial, but really hearing and listening what folks are telling you, and then taking that to be, so what's that next step? So now knowing we have to come back because we really uncovered only the first layer. Now we need to find out, okay, so we know all of you do have access. How many of you have to share that? And what we found out was, whereas in the beginning it was about 40% of our girls that we were working to find reliable technology for, it was more like 80% that we had to find, because that other 40% was sharing it with more than 3 people in their household. And so that was a significant barrier to be able to truly provide services so that they would effectively be able to continue their education as well as services. So that additional step led to us knowing, hey, there's a bigger gap that we need to fill. And so following, always having that open-ended, and then the technology that they follow as well. So part of what has been ongoing is our girls, you know, it's all about social media and how we use social media. We know if we're not getting a response to an email, we're not getting a response to a phone call, that if we put it out on social media, immediately we get a response. And so knowing which platforms are important to them. You know, I'm of the Facebook generation. You know, my children and our girls are like, that's like old people stuff, right? It's not about Facebook. And so recognizing which platforms they are constantly on, and being able to use those platforms as our method of education. And then using their voice is also important. We have an internal Girls Leadership Council that really, their leaders, think of student council in your traditional high school. Every center has that, and within each one of those groups, they have a representative in a statewide or PACE-wide council. Having them really get engaged in So how do we communicate this to our peers? That was a significant piece and learning for us that, we had never thought of in the past, but it came from listening to our girls, and we found that if we have their peers talk to each other and gather feedback, that they were going to be much more apt and much more open to providing that feedback.
I love how flexible you've been able to be and really adapting throughout the process and hearing what gets surfaced throughout the conversation. And I was smiling about your comment about going to social media, because I think, another key point here is don't get stuck in the current methodology. Be flexible, right? Let us adapt. COVID-19 has fundamentally shifted the way everyone is communicating. And that means that right now we also need to be considering changing our methodology of how we're asking and really matching our current community needs to what is existing, to how we're going to deliver the questions and closing that loop. We may be used to one-on-one conversations or in-person focus groups, but we saw the responses earlier today of how 61% of the people on the call have shifted to video conference. 54% were monitoring social media. So we know that shift is happening. And one thing that I want to highlight here is when we are recognizing that we may need to change our methods and that we do need to be shifting, to also be consulting our constituents on what the best way to reach them will be. We heard from you, Yessica, that all of the girls are on social media, and so meeting them there is a great way to do it. So making sure that our constituents are part of that conversation and then selecting the best method that's going to be appropriate as we make that shift in these times. Great. So I think the next one, that I'd love to touch on is that we do want to be asking actionable questions. Prioritizing listening and acting on feedback really does have the power to save valuable time and money. But it's important to be taking in any current limitations that have been surfacing right now into consideration. We are all experiencing shifts in our abilities and our priorities. We may be facing limitations in staffing or in financial capabilities. And it's really important right now to be taking that into consideration when we're designing our feedback process, especially when we're deciding which questions we're going to ask. We don't want to ask a question if we know from the beginning, if we know up front that we won't be able to respond to it, because especially right now, that trust is going to be key. And we want to be prioritizing asking the questions that we have the capabilities to respond to. Be clear about what it is we can offer and adapt the questions to really focus on the immediate needs of our affected communities. So, Yessica, I'd be really curious to hear, in what way you've been able to ensure that the feedback that you're getting is something you're able to act on and respond to.
Sure. So I think for us, it's been by engaging those key stakeholders. So there have been several times, whether it was something programmatic. So for the girls, we would include both the girls' voices and staff voices. So right now we're in the midst of working on what does reopening look like? What does going back to the centers look like? So we sent out a communication to all parents. With our Girls Leadership Council, they led center specific with their peers, just asking questions about what could it look like, what are their fears, what are their concerns, because then that way too we understand where they are emotionally and what are the things that we're going to have to work through beyond the logistics. And we actually had on the books a start date of August 3rd, and we had 4 pilot centers that were coming back July 6th, which is next week. But we met yesterday and actually have paused that based on their voices. Florida, right now we are a hot spot state and really looking at the data externally. So, what's happening in each community, but then also speaking with our girls and hearing in their voices the challenges that they had, representing both their families as well as their own personal perspective, and then our team members as well. And so hearing that and sharing with them, all being at the table and saying, so these are the things where we have flexibility. These are the things where we don't, and this is why we don't have flexibility. then it creates whatever that outcome is. Everyone has buy-in. So it isn't just, okay, you shared it with me, but they all felt part of that ultimate decision. And that's what we have found, to truly be important. Now, part of this time frames, just to be honest, in the conversations yesterday, I don't think that they were sure we were going to hear them. I think both staff members and girls were thinking that, okay, so they said they were going to listen, but are they really? And yesterday when we said, okay, you know what, we're not going to open the 4 pilots on July 6th. We can't. We're hearing what's being said. Everyone just took that huge sigh of relief. Part of it was in knowing that cases are going up, but the other part was, oh, this was real. You really are listening. And so that in itself bought so much trust, really created so much trust across the organization that is, what ultimately creates true engagement, whether it's a team member or whether it's a girl. She truly has felt cared for, and our girls many times haven't had that caring adult, or they've had trauma in their lives where they don't really trust people. And so these are experiences where we are living to what our values are and demonstrating. And yes, in this scenario, this was the answer, although there was a good 30% who were like, no, we have to come back. And so having them be part of the conversation, the full conversation that led to the decision of, no, we're not coming back, also helped create that buy-in with them.
Thank you, Yessica, for that. That really is key in that dialogue that you're able to have, recognizing that we won't be able to respond perfectly to what everyone has asked for because there is a difference in those opinions. But having that conversation and really explaining what you heard, what you're doing about it, and why you're not doing some of the things that others had asked for is key in closing the loop. And that's this last one, is don't forget to share out what you heard with the people who provided feedback in the first place. As you said, Yessica, these effective feedback loops really require that trust, and that's an ongoing process to build that trust and maintain that trust. But sharing that out and closing that loop is a key way to immediately addressing the needs that clients and constituents expressed, building that trust and letting them know that we value their time and input. Communicating about what we can do and why is essential, especially in this time of crisis when people have more on their plate than normal. That acknowledging the time that they gave us and following up on that will make such a difference in continuing to build that trust. And as we said before, with social distancing during COVID-19, this might not be able to happen in person, and finding the ways that we can report out that mirror the ways we collected our feedback in the first place will continue to help maintain those relationships. Because this is a time of extreme uncertainty, it's especially important to be as clear as possible with those that we are serving about what we've heard and how we're acting on it. So thank you, Yessica, for outlining all of that for us. And I just ask if you've got any final reflections on what it looks like for PACE to close the loop here before we pass it back to Eva.
Sure. I think, just reiterating the things that you've shared about, not stopping. We're continuing to listen and recognizing that sometimes we make missteps or we take missteps, and learning from that, because if you're truly listening, then people will share and you will learn, and learning actually helps to continue to create trust. And there have been times throughout this process where we didn't make the best decision, but we learned from it and we acknowledged it, and then we truly heard and listened to our constituents and shifted and ideally corrected it, so that we can continue through this process. And we know that, we're all facing what reopening, re-engaging looks like, and that we're going to make missteps throughout that process as well. One is we're going to, continue to keep our ears open and really hear what our girls and our team members are saying, but also learn. And if we need to shift, we will continue to shift, because at the end of the day, we're here to fulfill a mission and to move that mission forward, and we can't forget that. And so that's what we will always go back to as we continue through COVID, the recovery of COVID, but even beyond that is to truly be able to meet the needs of our girls, those we serve.
Well, thank you, Yessica. As I said at the beginning, you all are truly an inspiration in the feedback process, and I look forward to passing it back off to Eva and hearing about what communication looks like in Candid elsewhere.
Thank you. Thank you, Meg. Thank you, Yessica. And we did get some great questions from folks as y'all were talking, and I will actually take the time to ask two of them now, given that we're on this conversation. So the first one I think was a really practical one. Yessica, you mentioned discovering that there was a need for computers, internet from the girls that you're working with, that they were not able to connect. And this is a kind of a practical one. Like, how did you try to address that need? Assuming you don't have a room full of computers, just to hand out, what did you do? Did you turn to some of your current funders and supporters in case they could help? Was there like a corporation you reached out to? How did you manage that need?
Sure, so it was a team effort. One is we got our IT team immediately on it, going, what's available, what's quick, easy to adjust to meet the need. So what we actually found is we wanted data-enabled tablets was ideal for us. So once we knew what that it was, at the same time that IT was doing that, we had our advancement department reaching out to our funders and corporate sponsors to say that we have this need, is there an interest or willingness from the organization to help support that? And those things were happening simultaneously. So literally within a week's time frame, we knew the what, how much it was going to cost, and we already had several, we like to call them partners and investors in PACE lined up to help support those needs, because since we were very clear about what it was, immediately those supporters were there to say, you know what, we will purchase those, or what's the amount, we will support that financially.
Yeah, and I think having the information, right, direct feedback from your girls was really important in advocating for that support, it sounds like. And there was one more question, and this is more about sort of what questions to ask. And the question was posed with the idea of, is there like a template? Are there examples? But to me, it sounded like you were kind of organically thinking about what's important and urgent right now in order to stay in touch first, right? Like address the idea of how do we actually stay in touch with our girls as the primary question. And then after that, once the connection was established, you were able to ask follow-up questions. But any advice on sort of thinking through like what questions to ask, how to really stay in touch with the need? And Meg, I'd love your perspective on this as well.
So I'll jump in just from our end, and having learned, if we could do it over again, I think we would have shifted somewhat. Instead of us proposing those first questions and then getting some iterations and then realizing, oh wow, we didn't think of this, would have been to engage our girls from the very beginning. So that is something that is a lesson learned, and we've done since then. Was before we even send out that first, we do have this leadership council that represents all of our girls, and we would have, again, if we could do it all over again, included them in, hey, this is what we're working on. And they're learning about protocol, as in whenever you're doing a survey, as part of being in the leadership council. So we would have engaged them before we even sent out the first survey and said, what are the questions? What should we be asking? Because I am sure, I have no doubt, they would have told us this is the question that you really need to ask. So for us, that was a significant lesson learned.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's great, and unfortunately, I have to agree that there is no perfect template that's going to apply across the board for every organization, but really starting with what are the goals and the needs of asking for feedback right now? What are you trying to address? And then a key principle as you're designing your feedback process is, as Yessica said, to really test that with a core group that is a representative of your constituents to find out not only are these right questions that we should be asking right now, but also are we asking them in the right way? And being able to test with a small representative group first, being able to adapt the design and the plan of your process from there, the questions you're asking, how you're asking it, and then implement that adaptation to the larger community.
Well, thank you, Yessica. Thank you, Meg, for talking through some of these principles and how to apply them in practice. I think we are going to shift to sort of part 2 of our conversation. So let me do that here. We can go off screen for the moment, but the idea here is to start thinking about, how it is that you as an organization can share what's happening for you from from a programs and a mission perspective, as well as from a practice perspective in terms of how you're listening using your nonprofit profile on GuideStar. And again, before we delve into the telling you how you might do that, we'd love to ask a question, which is, at this time, we talked about how much you were listening to the people you serve, but I'm curious, how much are you communicating with your donors and supporters at the moment? And I see that Catalina has enabled the poll to be open. So you should be seeing that question in front of you right now. And I'm hoping that you can jump in with a quick answer to let us know, how much communication is happening with your donors and supporters at this point in time. I'll give us a moment to address that. I recognize that this is a circumstance in which things are changing week to week, month to month, both in terms of our ability to operate, in terms of our ability to really connect with the people and organizations that we serve. So it really is an extraordinary time to be managing. I see that over half of the folks have hopped in with an answer. I'll give us just a few more seconds, and then we'll share the results and talk a little bit about nonprofit profiles. This is great. So more than half, 60% of folks have engaged and voted. Catalina, I think it would be wonderful to see the results at the moment. So what we're hearing is that almost half of you are communicating more than usual with your donors and supporters. 18% less than usual, maybe are feeling a bit more disconnected, and 35% kind of considering it to be about the same. And that's really interesting. I think that many of us are weathering these circumstances in quite different ways, and in some ways that this poll actually shows that. So let's talk a little bit about one avenue that's open to you in terms of communicating with your donors and supporters, and that leads me to talk a little bit about the nonprofit profile. So many of you, I think, are familiar with GuideStar and nonprofit profiles on GuideStar, but what you may not know is that there is an opportunity for you as an organization to actually share current information about what's happening for you on the profile. So the profiles exist by virtue of the fact that there is a requirement for all charitable and nonprofit organizations to share public information with the IRS, and profiles are created as a result of that information, that there's publicly available information about organizations out there. Now, that information is not really enough to reflect the work and mission of your organization. It is really just kind of an information stub and a beginning of the profile, and there is an opportunity for you all to connect with your profile directly and to share more current information. We recognize organizations for doing that. So organizations can come in and essentially earn seals of transparency on GuideStar by providing information. So And there is a purpose behind the seals, right? The bronze seal really recognizes organizations for sharing some basic financial info, literally kind of who are you, information that ultimately helps donors actually find you. If you're not, if they can't find you, if they can't identify you, your mission, or your work, then they're not able to support you. So that bronze seal really are kind of the basic info. Then we also recognize organizations for sharing information about your financials, the financial transparency, with a silver seal. And that is really meant to make sure that potential donors and supporters can really understand kind of the size of your organization and have some trust in the way that you're operating and managing financials. The gold seal is really about your programs and goals. And so I like to say that it's kind of telling your story of the work that you do and what you're trying to achieve. And then the platinum seal is recognizing your organization for sharing specific and concrete measures of progress and results. So it's kind of the showing of the work that you're doing. You're talking about the metrics that you may already track to demonstrate your impact and your reach. So we're not asking you to do something new here. It's really about sharing what you already track to demonstrate your progress and your results. We do think that there are some significant benefits to earning a seal. You're able to build a trusted identity online for free, and some larger organizations, have the means to have their own website and communicate in really a large variety of ways. Many organizations have fewer means. The sector does have a lot of small organizations, and the profile is your opportunity to build that trusted identity online. GuideStar is a source of information for many types of constituents. We also, and I'll tell you a little bit more about this, the information from your profile doesn't only stay on GuideStar. It actually connects to a network of partners that we have that enable giving on their platform. So I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. And then finally, there is something, especially at this moment in time, where you're able to make certain critical updates once in this spot, and then that reflects on all of these platforms that are leveraging the information. So there is a bit of a time savings to making sure that your information is really current and you're managing it well. The network of partners that I mentioned is important, and it's kind of a behind the scenes or hidden feature of GuideStar. So you may see your profile if you Google yourself on GuideStar, as I call it. You'll probably find your organization's information up there, and I encourage you to do that. And then we do have a network of partners that elements of this information goes to. So your name, your address, your mission statement, frequently your logo, and some information about your programs is likely going to this variety of partners kind of on a regular basis. And some of them actually see your full profile, but in the kind of experience for that partner. So as an example, Fidelity Charitable, when a donor goes to make a donation from their account at Fidelity Charitable, they have an opportunity to search for organizations. When they do that search, the nonprofit profile comes up as a result. So I wanted you all to kind of understand that behind the scenes aspect to why it's important to have current information on GuideStar. This is just an example of how that information might show up. So we have a partnership with Charity Navigator where for organizations that have achieved a gold or platinum seal of transparency, some of those results or that information is showing up directly on the Charity Navigator website as well. Now, you might be wondering, like, what do I need to have in hand in order to participate? Well, we have a handy handout that we have already shared with you that essentially tells you some of the key elements of information that we're looking for in order to earn each seal. And what you'll see is that there's some information that's required for the seal, and then some information that's optional that's really meant to better reflect your organization's work, kind of better describe. But there's essentially, within the bronze seal, it looks like a lot, but there's about 10 pieces of information that we ask for that are really the basics, like who's the name of your leader, what's your address, what is your mission statement. Those are the types of things that we ask for that you already have. Within silver, there's a couple of ways to participate, either to share your audited financials or to provide some of those numbers by typing them in, and then gold and platinum have questions that go along with them as well. And then I will say that, we've been talking a lot about feedback, and there is an opportunity to actually share feedback practices through your profile as well. And it's really focused on how it is that are you listening to the people that you serve, and how are you doing so? And by sharing that information, we emphasize the importance of doing that on the profile. Now, before you can do the update, you do need to claim your profile. And I want to say just a moment about that, because most folks say, well, if I'm already on GuideStar, why do I need to do something or to claim? It's because we want to make sure that the right person modifies the right profile, right? We don't want someone else to kind of change the information if it's not about your organization. So there is a process where if you go on GuideStar and you click Update Nonprofit Profile, you'll have an opportunity to get started in claiming your profile, becoming associated with your organization. Once we vet you, and I encourage you all to use your work email address if possible, that makes things quicker and easier. Once we vet you, then you're able to come in and provide those updates. And here's a screenshot of that page that you'll see on how to claim. Now, I recognize we have only a few minutes before the end of our webinar. Time definitely goes by quickly. So let me see. I think let's actually see if there are some perhaps questions that have come in, and I'll move us forward to that part of the presentation. Some of these tips and tricks in terms of making sure that you publish your information, to see it officially on your profile, you'll have those in the handout after this webinar if you need them. And there are many additional resources essentially at under the support feature or help.guidestar.org, where you can look up some frequently asked questions about sort of how, what the seal is about, how to claim, and how to get support. So I will actually move us forward to maybe any questions that have come in. So let me take a quick look at what some of those things have been. So I see some great questions that have to do with the profile. Let me take a quick look here. Wonderful. So I see that there's some questions just about an organization that has provided some information but is wondering how long it takes to publish that information. So it typically, if you don't forget to press the publish button, it's a little bit like the way blogs work. You're editing your blog and then you have to hit publish for it to kind of become official. The nonprofit profile is a bit similar. You can edit to your heart's content, and then you have to actually hit the publish button in order to make sure that this information then shows up on the profile. If that has happened, then it takes about 15 minutes for it to become reflected officially on the GuideStar profile. So between hitting publish and it showing up on the profile, it can take up to 15 minutes. Usually it's a little bit quicker than that, but there is a process where the information actually has to flow through our systems and become publicly available. So that's kind of that's about as long as it takes. Oh, I see some folks are maybe having a little bit of trouble becoming associated with their profile. And I will say just a moment about that claiming process. So there's kind of two ways to get through the claiming process quickly. As I mentioned, the fastest way is really to claim your organization's profile as an employee with an email address that is officially associated with that organization. And that should take only a few minutes. And then for those of us who maybe, just using a Gmail address, that does take a little bit longer. As you might imagine, we want to make sure that there's appropriate vetting before we associate the person with the organization, so that the right person gets associated. And so that can take a couple of days to do that vetting or to provide the right documentation to enable that. And we're just trying to be kind of extra cautious to make sure that the right folks become associated. So I think that's all the information that I wanted to share at the moment. And I know we handled some questions for Meg and for Yessica before. So I will say, thank you again, Meg and Yessica, for participating in the program and for sharing some wonderful insights about, how we can keep listening to the people that we serve at this challenging time. And I will also highlight that there's an opportunity coming up from the Listen for Good initiative. There's a community of funders, the Fund for Shared Insight, that are really trying to support organizations in growing their feedback practice. And there's a new online community, Listen for Good, that is launching, where organizations can apply to participate in advancing their feedback practice. I believe that the kind of rules for who can participate and how, and what the deadlines are that are coming up in August are at this link at the Listen for Good Plus online website. And so again, you all will have access to this link afterwards. And for those of you that are thinking a little bit about, how can I do this better? How can I do this more? Please check that out as an opportunity that's coming up. Thank you again for participating in this webinar, and I will hand it over to Catalina just to bring us home.
Thank you so much, Eva, to you and our presenters, and thank you for everyone for attending today's webinar. On behalf of our team here at Candid and our presenters, thank you for joining today. If you liked this webinar, we hope that you join us again soon. Have a great rest of your day.